Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily show about everything that matters, with the world's leading commentators and thinkers. Hello, everybody. As 2025 winds down, one of my favorite books of the year was Dan Wong's Breakneck, China's Quest to Engineer the Future. Fascinating book, which compares China's engineering state with America's legal state. And I was intrigued that my friend Chris Schroeder, who every year publishes his favorite books of the year, included Wang's Breakneck on the list, and also has a fascinating Substack report on his recent trip to China, the first time he's been in China for 6 years. So, Chris, is the China that you saw, that you've just come back from, is that Dan Wang's China, the China that he describes in Breakneck, a China that is both incredibly dynamic, but also in other ways completely stuck?
Yeah. Dan is a friend, and I must say over the years is one of the most thoughtful analysts that I've seen on China. So this book is really, really a great statement of what he does. And it is. And in fact, it's interesting because the way the book is often portrayed is sort of comparing the engineering style of both governance and the business elements of China versus this legalistic approach and process that is America. So you would think at a surface level that it was sort of a pro-China, they've got it all worked out kind of a thing. And in reality, it is an extraordinarily nuanced, candid view of both the opportunities that come with this quote unquote engineering mindset, but also the challenges that come with it. And I saw that completely. In a way, this trip, very, very different from 6 years ago, was a tale of two cities. Because if I talked to the tech crowd, they were all sort of up and to the right and very excited about AI and robotics. I visited a Xiaomi automotive plant and literally watched 92% plus a robotics plant was the output. I saw a car assembled in 20 seconds. And when you're in that milieu...
Oh, and Chris, say that again. You saw a car assembled in 20 seconds?
Yes, the
whole car. Mean?
The whole car beginning to end was about 76 seconds, but literally the assembly of the car was the parts and the body would come up and the robotics would come above it. And you kind of watch it and count 20 seconds and the thing is fully assembled. Then it does final stuff on the other end of it and some stuff before it. And you look at that, and it's a case example of huge questions that America and the West, frankly, Europe needs to think about from a competitiveness perspective. It raises all the questions about what does it mean when you eliminate these kinds of jobs in a place with China, who values harmony. And there are a lot of trade-offs in life that I think Dan captures extremely well about what happens when everything is happening in an engineering text, but engineers sometimes are not empathetic. They don't necessarily have political understanding. They solve problems technically and not holistically. And that was completely what my experience was. I talked to dozens and dozens of people, cab drivers, car drivers, translators, parents, and you really had a sense of uneasiness that people at one level felt that they were very strong and can be very dynamic in a challenging time, and it is a challenging time in China's economy now, but that a lot of the excitement around this technology and engineering also causes a lot of confusion and concern.
Dan Wang's comparison with China that gets stuff done, that builds cities within months and maybe cars within minutes, and the US where nothing ever seems to get done. Huge debate here on that, triggered by people like Ezra Klein. Did you, coming from the US, you live in Washington, D.C., you spend a lot of time traveling around the US too, were you struck by the contrast between China, which gets stuff done, sometimes for the better, not always for the better, and the US where nothing gets done, where they can't build high speed trains, or it seems anything else these days?
Well, I mean, again, it's depending which US that you're talking about right now. I mean, the United States has people like SpaceX, where my son works, and they're landing rocket engines, which was beyond fantasy just a few years ago. So there's a lot getting done. But when we think about governance and policy, I will say that I am a Democrat, small d. Like, I believe very strongly in the rule of law and democracy, as I was raised with in many ways. But there's no question that in places like China, even Singapore and other places in Asia, there's a tremendous emphasis put on, did you deliver the goods or did you not? You have a plan, you put it out there, either you deliver it or you don't. And that level of accountability, the speed around accountability, the quality about the accountability, at the end of the day, I think gives a lot of people a sense that there's almost a contract between they and the government, in that as long as my life is being delivered, the services and capabilities and safety and so on that they promise, things can be pretty good. I think the challenge of China is that their economy itself, perhaps in part because of the overemphasis on the engineering side, I've been told repeatedly there's 25% unemployment for people in their 20s. Everyone I know I spoke to was talking about real estate prices down 30%. I mean, it is really, as I said, a tale of two cities. On the other hand, I think one of the challenges in the West is that more and more people really ask the question, is government at best incompetent and at worst an insider's rigged game? And that is a very dangerous question historically for democracy, because if at the end of the day, democracy does not deliver, it is not a surprise that you get some of the populism that we see both left and right around the West overall. Neither has got this licked. Both are having significant problems in navigating it. But one of the problems that China does not have is, do they deliver the goods when it comes to the commitments that they make in a given time?
Huge debate in the US about China. Lots of China hawks, both on the left and the right. You, I'm guessing, aren't, although you're not someone who went there with rose-tinted glasses. Are you concerned with the kind of paranoid press that China often gets in the US?
I think what I was most concerned about is that, and this is very different than 6 years ago in China, is that I saw almost no Americans at all. Literally, I went to Xi'an. I wanted to see some second-tier cities, so I went to Xi'an and Nanjing. I have a very dear friend in Xi'an, and they kind of me around to see and talk to people, and very interested. Go to see the Terracotta Warriors, which is one of the great historic sites in the world. And it was just packed with tourists. And there were literally 7 people from the West, and I kind of snuck up around them. 4 of them were Russian, 2 of them were French speaking in some form, and then me. And I have to tell you, even in Shanghai, which is obviously known as a tremendous global city, I saw almost no Westerners. And that's not a good thing. I worry about that, because if you're not on the ground, you have no sense of nuance. You get kind of caught in a narrative which is much more macro. You don't get a sense of really what's happening on the ground. And in many respects, that worries me, because it feeds into what you're asking right now. I don't think that you can have a good sense of how to deal with something which is historically without precedence for Americans. Like, for the first time, really, since World War II, we have a country that is built that is in many ways toe-to-toe technologically and in business as we are. And we've never seen that before. Korea with Samsung, and Japan certainly shuck things up in America in the 90s as it did in automotive. And capacity, particularly in the level of technology, is without precedence. And it does not help us to look at that through the lens of previous models like Cold War and who's up and who's down, without stepping back a little bit and saying, okay, here's the reality as it is. Old playbooks may not necessarily be the new playbook, and there may even be, in fact, opportunities to, one, build the strength that you have, but secondly, over time, develop, kind of relationships about global issues that will continue to haunt us all. But I think at the end of the day, if you don't get on the ground, you're never going to have that same sensibility.
And of course, China isn't Japan of the 80s. It's not supposedly an economic threat that will disintegrate or dwindle. China is.
Well, remember, in the 90s, nobody thought Japan. I mean, it's interesting, because at one level, the language used about China today was very similar to Japan in the 90s, and they were buying Rockefeller Center.
In the 80s or the 90s?
No, it started in the 80s for sure, with the Deming quality manufacturing processes, and the automotive industry of Toyota and Honda and so on began to really rise there. But even by the 90s, I remember there was this book that was leaked. I was in the State Department at the time, and there was a book that was leaked called The Japan That Can Say No. And it got everybody steamed up in Washington, D.C., because effectively arguing that Japan was not necessarily going to be, in a term that's now has been used to describe China, a responsible actor. And they were plotting to do all sorts of things. And at that time, there were not a lot of people who were predicting that it was going to kind of flatline and go through the challenges that it did through the rest of the 90s and the aughts. And I think that even to this day, sometimes people will say, isn't China a big Japan? And I think the circumstances are just totally different. There's 1.4 billion reasons why it's different. But on top of that, I think the nature of the advancement around technology innovation, defense tech and other areas is different. I think the rise of a middle class to the tune of hundreds of millions of people is a new thing. And so I think that analogy does not hold. But it remains interesting that we in the American mindset spoke that way as we were speaking in many ways as we're speaking about them now. And I think, again, then and now, the best thing to do is have as clear a head as you can and be focused on what it is that we want to do for us and with our allies. And, if there's room to maneuver with China, that would be fantastic. And if not, the world keeps moving, because the one thing that is crystal clear is China's not going anywhere. What China's leadership will look like 10 years from now, what our leadership will look like 10 years from now, what is our relationship with our allies? 10 years is a lifetime in AI and technology. Nobody knows. So that, to me, I think should be the focus of how we think about it.
More than a lifetime, a series of lifetimes.
Yeah.
One of the areas that I thought the Wang book was really good on was the failure of the one-child policy, both in moral terms and in economic terms, and his suggestion that
Brilliant.
China faces its own demographic crisis, so that might be interesting. And let me ask you, Chris, and I don't know the answer to this, which is rather embarrassing, because I'd like to go to China, and I never really made much of an effort. Wang himself notes in his book that he's not allowed to go there anymore. Is it easy to go? I mean, do you just buy a ticket to get visas? Do you have to do a lot to actually do what you did?
It's never easy, and the visa application is a very lengthy one and so on. And I think in the case of Dan and some other people don't get visas. I mean, the idea that an American would be, grabbed there certainly is never impossible in many places. But I think mostly it's about, do you get the visa or don't you? I lucked out in that the visa I got in 6 years ago was a 10-year visa. So I actually didn't even have to go through a new process. But, I had guides and handlers and other things that helped me, which I think made it very clear that mostly I was there as a tourist. I mean, I met business people and I was thinking about the future of business and policy, but I was there really fundamentally as a thoughtful tourist. And I think most people can do that. And what's interesting now, particularly after the meeting between President Trump and President Xi, and now there's rumor that there may be 4 meetings that they're planning next year. At least for the very short term, there's a different kind of dialogue of Western journalists who are not allowed into China in the last few months just to receive visas to go back. Now, I will note that those visas are 6-month visas, so we don't really know what that means. I have a very good friend who just came back from a track 2. They call in Washington these dialogues when you get people who are no longer in government to meet with people in places like China. They called it kind of a second track or track 2. And a very good friend of mine is a former general who went on a track 2 every year with China. And he said this year felt a lot different. The conversations were more candid. They were more solicitous. They were more normal. And so there is always a possibility that things may be opening in new ways. But it is very, very hard to make that bet. But I would say, therefore, this is actually a very interesting time for people to go and try to sniff around and see if, in fact, things might be different, or whether or not it's just a temporary opening for whatever machinations and things go back to the way that they were. But in one level, and I don't even like the term going back, because in a way it's all about going forward. I became very convinced in this trip, and talking to a lot of people who are much smarter about China than I will ever be, that China in many respects gets up in the morning, going to bed at night, not thinking about America. They get up in the morning, go to bed at night thinking about China. And one of the things they've learned, and frankly other countries around the world have told, I heard this in India and elsewhere, if anything was learned in the last 5 or 7 years, with supply chains and things like that, is nobody wants to be over-reliant on anyone for anything. I mean, somehow or other we woke up one day and 90+% of all chips of high end were made in one island. We woke up one day in Europe and 90+% of our oil and gas came from one country. And I think a lot of places in the world are sort of saying, what is the right hedge strategy? What is the right way to not be over dependent on anyone? And I think China, much of their strategy right now is to make sure at the end of the day, they've got the resources, they have the technology, they have the markets, they have what they want, in the spirit of never having to be reliant on anyone ever again. And I think sometimes people misunderstand that and don't realize, one, that's a very strategy. And secondly, it begs a very, very powerful question, which is, the more independent and less necessary that they have to engage in other places in the world means other parts of the world, even someone as big and strong as America, our leverage is now actually declining as opposed to rising. Therefore, as strategists, we should be thinking about what is the reality of a world we're heading towards where our leverage will differ at least, and maybe it will be lesser. We may be having this massive country that doesn't care as much about having access to our markets over time, though they appear to now. And how does that play out? How do we have to think about that? I don't have any answers to it, but I must say these are some of the questions I'm asking people much smarter than me since I've gotten back.
You're definitely giving me a taste to go. Although my understanding is it's rather hard to go in the sense that, for example, to use the train system, you have to pay on a Chinese app, and foreigners don't have access to that app. I'm sure there
No,
are.
no longer. It was easy as pie. I mean, in advance, you can get your credit card, your Visa on WeChat Pay or Alipay, and it frankly was almost humblingly simple. And by the way, this means I go to a Jinbing, a guy who sells these little breakfast pancakes, and they don't take cash. They take my Alipay or whatever. It just simply could not have been easier. And so that dynamic, which was true when I was there 6 years ago, is really quite different now. I mean, you run into bumps because you run into bumps and going sometimes from region to region, you can run into bumps. There are wonderful groups. I often use a wonderful group out of Silicon Valley called Wild China, who has arranged for me translators and cars, and sometimes I want them for history and all. But I know that if I have problems, I can fall back on people, and there are lots of ways to handle it. But a lot of Americans do not know, really had almost no exposure in school to the extraordinary history of this country. I mean, people think it's a country, but it's a civilization. I think the only continuous civilization over thousands of years, which is deep part of who they are and how they think of themselves. And that doesn't mean that it's monolithic at the same level either. You go to different countries. I there who lectured me that I should take all my learning from places like Beijing, go to Hunan and talk to them. Hunan are fearless people, and they'll tell you exactly what they feel. And you get these sort of interesting dynamics, which are not monolithic. And yet at the same time, when you have 5,000 years of a shared history, when you have a shared language, a shared culture, in many ways, a history of Confucianism, there are many things that unify in a very powerful way. But I'll go where you just were, which is the only way to begin the journey. And I could take this trip every year for what remaining years I have left in my life, and I won't even get rounding error of understanding of China. But each time you come away with better questions, each time you come away with a better appreciation of what's happening there, that you're never going to get on Instagram or TikTok here, or by some pundit talking about who's up and who's down, which of course is the proclivity, as you pointed out before, much of the dialogue here.
You've noted the civilizational quality of China. You do a lot of reading, and we'll come to some of your favorite books of the year in a few minutes. Do you get the sense, Chris, that Xi's China is very much within that civilization? Some people present it as somehow being different, as being foreign to the historical traditions in China. Others suggest that it's part of that continuous tradition, both in terms of centralization of power and perhaps the absence of democracy.
There's a wonderful book. It's on my list called The Rise and Fall of the East. And East is an acronym, EAST. And it actually, in a way, tells a story of the history of the famous test that during the Empire years, the Emperor years, that really, if you wanted any chance, by the way, from anywhere in the country to really rise within the society, you had to pass this very complicated, very difficult test, and then you'd have a big government job and whatever. And the test, in many ways, then, and then it got the new version of it got dropped during the Cultural Revolution. Now there are different tests to get into top universities. But one of the outputs of that test is the sense of a unity, of a one, of everyone having to learn some of the same things or aspire to the same things within a given system, very much based on Confucianism sort of theory of life and how you engage with your family, how you give your parents, and everything else. And people much more sophisticated than I will say that Xi is very much in that tradition, and he certainly uses history a great deal in the way that he speaks and the way that he conveys things in what is often called Xi Jinping thought. People smarter than me have to talk about where those differences are. Clearly, this is a very different China politically than the China that a lot of Americans got excited about when they were acceding to the WTO and stuff like that. And yet people, again, much smarter than I will say, in many respects, people who thought at the end of the day that China was going to enter the world order simply in the terms of the way the new order had been formed, once they became very, very strong and powerful, were in many respects naive. Interesting, one of the other books that I read, biography on Brzezinski, and it's just a fascinating look
Yeah, Ed's
at
a
the
friend,
history of that
and he
time.
was on the show. It's an excellent book. It's big,
Yes, it is. It's old school, great biography. I mean, Ed, has a column, Financial Times. He certainly has a strong political view, but none of that's in the book. The book is just deeply well reported and goes through it. But one of the things that jumped out to me, it was even Brzezinski as early as the 90s was saying, we should not get overly triumphal when the wall fell. We should not get overly triumphant when China wanted to learn from us and engage with us and be in WTO, because eventually you were going to build stronger people who wanted their own say. They weren't merely going to be a version of America. And I have to confess to you, I think I fell into this in the 90s and the aughts somewhat, where I just sort of assumed that the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the fall of communism, as it was described by Fukuyama and at the time others, meant that people really deep down wanted to be a version of. When I talk to younger people now, they'll say, yeah, there was a lot in a lot of America we wanted to be a part of at the time. But at the same time, first and foremost, we are of our country. And when you're of your country, yes, you benefited by the system, America. I mean, this is the irony. China benefited tremendously from being in the WTO and being a part of many things that America and the West had built. And at the same time, once they reached scale, we should not be overly surprised, and it should impact the way we think about strategy going forward. We should have been the way we thought about strategy 10 or 15 years ago, that a rising power doesn't want to necessarily play by a rule book that they did not set. And then we have to determine that rule book, in fact, is a right rule book. We want to lean into it. Our allies want to lean into it. We will offer the best opportunity through that for people to rise and for people to get a great education. But remember what I said before, that's fine. But if you don't deliver the goods, you're going to have problems. And I think that's part of what we're seeing, not just in America, but I think across Europe.
When you're walking around China, do you get a sense of nervousness?
I would tell you that there was.
It's like going to Russia in the 1930s, but
No, I would not say that, because I moved around very freely, had incredibly interesting and open conversations. The restaurants were energetic, and I went to. It's very funny. There's some millennial CEO friends I had there who wanted to show me what the younger generation is doing. They took me. I think it's even government built, but it's a massive collection of clubs in Shanghai, and you see all these kids in their late teens and early 20s. They're all dressed differently. They're all dressed hip. They're all imitating different kind of their favorite, stars, whether they're K-pop or China or even Taylor Swift or whatever. And they have this strong sense of individuality in their outlook. And you get a sense of all of that as a interesting energy to understand. But I must say, 6 years ago, you felt this sort of buzz of ascendancy, and there's a greater, I don't want to say conservatism, but there's a weight that was different than I felt before. But other people, particularly some of the business executives, would say to me, in a way, that was a good thing, that it is a good thing, meaning that there was this go-go period, and go-go periods always have excess. And to get back to first principles, even if it's a painful series of first principles, is something that China has done throughout their history, to your earlier question. And they have a long ability of resilience. In a way, it was often suggested to me, not with a small tweak, they think that they're more able to navigate resilience over multiple years than America is, because of our election cycles and the fact that we're a little more short-term focused by the structure of who we are. That I can't really comment on. I think people underestimate how resilient Americans and Westerners and people in democracies. We forget democracies did some of the greatest building of the 20th century. We fought 2 wars and won them. Like, there are many things that you can execute upon and deliver in democracy, but it has these other kinds of challenges. And in many ways, Andrews, I'm reflecting on this trip overall in your question. There's similarities. There's this idea that the wealthy are getting very wealthy, the tech people are all fired up, and the rest are uncertain.
Yeah, it's interesting on the generational front. You write about it in your newsletter. You talk about a different generation, new generation coming. You even quote Taylor Swift. When you're at these clubs, when you get these people privately, do they talk politics to you? I mean, either in terms of their sense, do they ask you questions about the US? Do they indicate any dissatisfaction with the level of freedom in China, or they're just not bothered?
it was very interesting that every so often, particularly among the younger people, you would get a version of that. Sometimes I talk to parents who are like, look, America has got plenty of its problems, and we're seeing them. We may even have had a kid in America. I may have studied in America, whatever. And they almost look at it as an investment trade-off. I had several parents say to me, I could spend $500,000 or whatever it is to send a kid to a 4-year college in America, and there's a reason to do that. But is that ROI really better than having them do amazing stuff here? And so you got people sort of thinking about trade-offs and balances in that way. Some people, one-on-one and in more intimate settings, were surprisingly blunt about how they felt about politics, but it really usually this unto times that we're in. And again, there was something very familiar in that. What I have an 11-year-old daughter, someone said to me, like, is she going to go to a 4-year college? Like, what does that even mean? And how is AI? I got an unbelievable discussion all the time about AI. Like, what does it mean? Is my kid going to be using AI for school? And is it writing her papers? And these are the kinds of conversations you and I hear from our friends here also. That to me was quite interesting and quite consistent.
You're from an Italian immigrant family, Chris. You're one of your fellow countrymen or previous countrymen, Marco Polo, of course, famously went to China. But what he wrote afterwards tended to be more about Europe than China itself. It triggered his own take on European civilization, or perhaps lack of civilization. What did your trip to China teach you about America? And you've done, you mentioned before we went live, I know you've traveled 200,000 miles this year. You're an unusually international American. You spend a lot of time in India, Latin America, in Europe. You're the chairman of the German Marshall Fund. So you're about as international as it gets.
I think, there are a couple of vectors to go down. The act of traveling as much as I do means I never have a depth of understanding that my friends who really either study it or from there, I'll never get close to, but it gives me interesting pattern recognition or connection among different places and ability to ask maybe better questions than I would have the year before I traveled to any given thing. And what I would say to you is that the two things that really struck out with me, well, three maybe, on the trip to China in terms of taking back about America, is that curiosity has never been more valuable. And as I said to you before, the fact that there's so much separation going, not just in terms, there's still a lot of business going on between the two countries. There's still a lot of connection. But I think that there's less sort of day-to-day bottom-up connection, which I don't think is a good or smart thing in terms of really understanding the lay of the land and where things can go overall. Secondly, that there's incredible value put both top-down and bottom-up about does governance, however you define it, or it could be your company, does it or does it not deliver the goods? There is an implicit understanding of expectation that when you say you're going to do something, you're going to do something. And that is a level of accountability. I just was watching some old videos of Lee Kuan Yew, who of course was the man who made Singapore into a country when it had literally nothing when it was built, who was really one of the great analysts on China. And it's staggering 10 years after he died, how much of what he said about China then has actually come true in China today. And he was very, very clear in many interviews. At the end of the day, if you're rising in the system there and you have an expectation of delivering, you don't deliver, you go sideways or you go down and you're out. And that sort of sense of accountability and delivering of the goods, we can make an argument about whether China does it or at what price. That's very reasonable debate. But the idea that that is something that is enormous in the way we want to deal with each other, the way that we have expectations about our governance, however we define it, I think was very, very large. That there's something going on, meaning that it is very easy, auto manufacturer, to say, I need to be reliant on things being built in China, or because I want a cheaper system or things that work, or I want access to the Chinese market, which is all understandable. But when you start visiting what's happening there now, the one observation every business person should make and every policy maker should make is that they are toe-to-toe in many, many, if not most ways, and certainly ones that matter. And we have to ask ourselves, what do we want from that? You can't contain that. You can't keep that down, is my view. And by the way, people who are experts in China disagree with me on this. But my view is, as one very senior Singaporean said to me a couple of years ago, the best way to compete is to compete. And compete means deliver the goods, deliver on time, be fast, be reliable, be cheap. And this is about governance as well as in business. And there are certain areas right now where for us to say now is a day for us to go toe to toe with them, I think we actually literally have to step back and say, what are the things that are most important? What are the things uniquely qualified to do? What regulation to allow us to do it? What other regulation may require to take toe to toe any issues that are under in trade practices or whatever, and to have a real strategy about what it means to be a great country in the next 5 years. And there are elements of things that we're doing. It was America that came up, as quickly and efficiently and really almost historically with the COVID vaccine. I mean, we shouldn't forget these stories. We shouldn't forget what we're doing in space right now. We shouldn't forget that for the moment, we are truly leaders in areas of AI and chip manufacturing, particularly at the highest end, and sort of our innovation that allows us to do the things that we do. But at the same time, we can no longer take that for granted. And it came back to me that a bunch of humility and a lot of execution and a lot of discipline and some longer term strategy are required. But our political system does not have a lot of incentive for those things. The incentive is short term. It's social media, get people all fired up. It's about fundraising for early hits. And that to me is I think as I look out, that to me is quite concerning.
Yeah, one of the books that you picked out as you're a remarkable reader. You really seem to read. I mean, you traveled 200,000 miles, I guess, got nothing else to do on these flights.
That's true.
You chose a particularly interesting book. One of the books this year, two books about America. One is Thomas Fleming's A Disease in the Public Mind, a new understanding of why we fought the Civil War, which is about the corruption of public discourse in the years running up to the Civil War. And then a much more positive book, Freedom's Forge, How American Business Produced Victory in World War II. So these are the two bookends. The one is a warning. The other offers so much promise. Chris,
I think you said that beautifully, because the first book is a warning. It's a caution. Fleming, who died a couple of years ago, was very provocative because there have been hundreds of books, if not thousands, about why the Civil War came. And goes down. He said at some point, in these and beyond, among the other things that happened was that the sides stopped hearing each other and only demonized each other and left no room to maneuver. And obviously, he's not saying slavery was acceptable in any form. It was not saying maybe at the end of the day, war was inevitable. But the point that he was making was that there were actually interesting solutions. The British, for example, in the Caribbean had paid compensation to end slavery there without the Civil War. And Thomas Jefferson's grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, was actually having some significant success in getting legislatures in Virginia to start thinking about how to do that. But in the end, people on both sides of geographically, I mean, there were many people who rejected those ideas within the South. And then, of course, in the North, very understandably, there were people who say these people are only evil. There is no room to maneuver. This is a binary thing, lecturing each other, pointing fingers at each other. And at one point, people no longer spoke to each other. They no longer understood what were the essence of people had. And then war became inevitable. To be clear, he was not saying that this was not worth fighting for. He was merely saying there were other scenarios that eradicated when people were no longer walking in each other's shoes to try to understand where creativity might have occurred. And I thought a lot about that in today's environment. And I think a lot about it also with our engagement with China. We don't want to lose our room to maneuver. We want to be able to have creativity and engagement. But of course, we live in an era now where either you're my friend or my enemy. You're a traitor or you're not a traitor. You're on my side or not. Everything that happens politically, I mean, politics has always been performative in some form, but with social media, every time something happens, people go out there and they literally take the performative stance. No one gets paid a lot of money to say, wait a minute, maybe I'm wrong on this, and maybe that other person has got a pretty good idea and I should understand it because there might be something to learn. So it really was a book of caution. I think you expressed that beautifully. And of course, Freedom's Forge is just an incredible story. Whatever you think about Franklin Roosevelt politically, he really got early that he needed to gear up. This was even before Lend-Lease. He needed this country to gear up for what was very likely coming our way in some form. And he instantly, by the way, many people in his party condemned him for doing this, reached out to big industry. And if you're left of center, you don't want to be reaching out to big industry, but he did it anyway because he knew these are people who could build things. These would be the right people to figure out how we could be the 17th ranked army in the world and then get very quickly ready for a war should it come. And it's an extraordinarily upbeat. And so whenever anybody says to me, democracies don't build, I'm like, read this book, because that's an excuse. The democracies are messier, they're deliberative. That's the power of democracy. But to suggest that that means by definition you can't build under democracy is against all the evidence, both historically and I still thinking of examples of today.
You were on the Andreessen Horowitz podcast recently. I know you're close to both Mark Andreessen, Ben Horowitz. Are you concerned, Chris, about the shift in the zeitgeist? Bernie Sanders recently announced that he thought there should be a moratorium on data centers, and more antipathy towards everybody from Musk and Thiel and Altman to Andreessen and Horowitz.
Look, I think you painted with a very broad brush a lot of different individuals who are doing different things. I think what I find happening a lot is that people will simplify and make performative the arguments. And so what they'll say is we should tax all billionaires, or billionaires are the problem, which to me is a complete dodging of the harder questions, which is, why do we have the homelessness that we have in our cities when we spend $70,000 per homeless person every year administratively? Why are we having the crime problems in some of our greatest cities that we've had today? They're just, the harder questions are not, should you slap more taxes on billionaires? I am not sophisticated enough to tell you whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, or how to think about that in the process. The idea that we should be demonizing people who have been some of the greatest builders in our country without in parallel saying, okay, what is it that we want to deliver on, frustrates me. Because at the end of the day, you could tax every billionaire to zero and you're still not addressing the challenges which are so important for us to be competitive in the next 5 to 10 years. So to me, have a reasonable debate about how people are behaving or what they're doing, if they're invading people's lives. Let's have that discussion wherever it may be, left or right. But to me, when people start doing this demagogic political stuff, left or right, they're actually really hiding from the harder questions. And the harder questions are one that are going to make a difference about whether, if we have kids graduating our schools who have 8th grade reading and math skills, that is what matters. And I don't care. There's nothing you can do to a single billionaire that's going to actually answer that in a concrete way. And that's the conversation I think we should be having. There's a great comedian, I love him, Ronnie Chen, who I'm sure you've seen him on Netflix and other stuff. He was with Stewart before. I don't know what his politics is, but he has this funny skit where he effectively says, I admire so many people today who, they're willing to die for their country. I'm like, God, that's unbelievable. You got to die for your country. What a dramatic thing. What a great statement of patriotism. I love this country. I admire people who want to say that. But to die for your country, are you willing to learn math for your country? And I always found it very funny, because I think he's right. I think that we get sort of spun up about these great things, which become very easy to have resentment about each other. It goes back to the Fleming stuff. It's very easy to put people in simplistic buckets. But the real question at the end of the day for the future of our country is, in order to build things in a now extremely competitive world, there are a whole bunch. We need to travel. We need to learn from each other. We have to know that the next 10 years are not like the next 10 years. And there are deep-seated structural problems that business as usual, the stuff that got us to that point, will not be the stuff that gets us out. That to me is the conversation, not whether or not a given billionaire is a bad person or a given mayor is putting his hand in the kitty. All that stuff, we can talk about it. But to me, that's not even 10% of what we should be talking about.
Yeah, and you're a traveler, and that's why I like your book list, because it's not just China or America. You've got some really interesting books, Chris. I have to admit, I hadn't even heard of this one. It sounds fascinating. Scamlands inside the Asian empire of fraud that preys on the world, by someone called Snigdha Poonan. Tell me about this book and why people should read it. It offers a very different take on the Asian or China.
Snigdha is an Indian journalist, one of my favorite journalists, full stop. I mean, it's just a great reporter's reporter. She digs in. Her previous book was a book called Dreamlands, where when I think she wrote it or was reporting on it, she might have been in her early 30s, and she interviewed all across India 19 to 22-year-olds. And I remember her saying to me that she thought, I'm 32 or whatever I am. Obviously, I have a lot in common with 20-year-olds. And her biggest takeaway in reporting on the book is that she had almost nothing in common with them. Their mindset was different. Their aspirations to wealth were different. Their access to technology, they never knew a world without it. And she just has this journalist ability to kind of dig in and listen. And one of the things that she picked up in that first book were that people were willing to do what it took to make a lot of money, even if it crossed lines that you and I would not be comfortable with. And she asked a lot of questions about that. She really wanted to kind of understand what that was meaning. And she really goes deep into the world, which is huge in India, but quite frankly, it's huge in Cambodia, it's huge in Vietnam, it's huge around the world. We're literally communities and cities of people. It's a machinery. It's almost a gray economy juggernaut to the tunes of billions of dollars of scamming people, very often in the West and very often in America of certain age. And it is literally machineries of people who are doing the phone calls. They're going to be using AI in new ways to really do incredible damage to society. And so that's going to be a very interesting period. And the book, I think, is a warning shot and a tremendous piece of reporting.
I think as soon as you started talking about Scamlands, your lights went off, Chris.
Yeah, I know. That's a bad sign. I was just thinking the same thing.
A couple of other books which I found particularly interesting. The book, The New India. I know
Yes.
you do a lot of traveling in India as well. And again, you're not an India expert, but does India offer perhaps a politically more palatable alternative to the Chinese model for many other countries in the South?
You know, the end of the day, India is an enormous country with enormous talent and all the potential that you'll have. And even Lee Kuan Yew said this 10 years ago, India will not be China. Ironically, and I heard this a lot when I was in India, democracy actually weighs it down to the earlier part of our conversation. Meaning that if the head says, you do this, the guy will say, well, you didn't elect me. Or the woman says, at the end of the day, I'm a governor of an area. I'll do it at my speed and the way that I want to do it. And that a lot of the potential can get lost in process. A lot of the potential can get lost in corruption. A lot of it can get lost in different political sides of it. So how that plays out is going to be interesting to watch. Obviously, a lot of major companies, as they've been de-risking from China, have been coming to India and looking for opportunities there. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. I think the jury is still out. The book that you pointed out was written by another very brave journalist and a great writer, Rahul Bhatia, where he drives down the middle, but he tells the history of the rise of the BJP, the main party right now of Modi, and its history in a century. It really goes back. There was a political movement which still exists today that's even more conservative called the RSS, and he gives just a history, and it's very thoughtful, and it's a real understanding, and it's not vituperative, it's not necessarily lecturing, but it raises all the questions in a way that can the new India, with the constraints of politics and the sort of shifts that are happening politically, deliver to its potential. And the fact of the matter is, none of us know the answer to that yet. But I will tell you that when I was in India and I met with entrepreneurs and venture capitalists and whatever, the potential is unquestionable, not just in terms of size and scale, but just raw talent and desire to have impact and make things different and better. So we'll have to see.
Yeah, Bhatia was on the show last year. Final book before we get to a couple of predictions about 2026. It's a book with an eerie title by, and I hadn't heard of the book, Omar El Akkad. One day everyone will have always been against this. I'm guessing this is a rather troubling book, Chris.
Every page of the book is troubling, and every page, all of us, it'll make many people uncomfortable. It'll make everybody uncomfortable. And it raises a question in the context, of course, Israel and Gaza, which is the experience that he brings to bear in very poignant and very provocative ways. But in a way, he's raising a much broader question about us and human nature and what we're willing to accept to move on our day-to-day basis. And there are many things in your and my life and everyone's life that we sort of don't want to ask the harder questions. We don't want to really understand both sides very well. It's easier not to. I had a friend of mine who was a great journalist in the Middle East, an American journalist who was in Jerusalem for many years and for the Washington Post and others. And I remember once she referred to something that worried her in the way that she called it was the third cappuccino syndrome. And what she was saying was, you know, at the end of the day, we get comfortable in our lives. And you could go to Berlusconi's India at that time, and you know that a lot of corruption and tough things were happening. But you go out, and everywhere you go in Italy, the cafes are filled, and people are thrilled, and the laughter is loud, and the music is beautiful, and the people are dressed hot, and it's all great. And we order our third cappuccino. And I think all of us have to be reminded that when the tough issues come, particularly in an environment of social media, it becomes extremely easy to sort of say, well, I get upset about it for a day or two, and then I move on. Very easy. And I think that's always been true in human nature, but I think in many respects, social media compounds that, particularly as it also drags us into our own echo chambers. And so this book is going to be very, very uncomfortable because it talks very bluntly and reportedly about Gaza, but it pushes very, very hard on the broader question of what are we willing to hear? What are we willing to challenge ourselves on? What are we willing to challenge our leaders on? Particularly when our echo chamber or our people like us or our tribe or whatever you want to call us have a very strong cultural view in one way. And going back to what I said before, when politics becomes about identity, your ability to accept in its totality, one argument for very, very complicated issues, and you're not willing to stray from that, I think that's where a lot of problems happen. That frankly, we're back to the Fleming book, because I think in many respects, that's
Right, I think
what he was talking about.
Right, and about people often look back and imagine, how could have Americans ever accepted slavery?
I've received criticism for advocating that this is a book that's worth reading, and there's not every element of the book I agreed with, but every page of it I felt had to be read, and it made me uncomfortable at every page.
Finally, Chris, let's think about 2026, beginning of the second quarter of the 21st century. You're too smart to venture to give predictions, but three questions. Firstly, you're a remarkable world traveler. Where would you like to go in 2026 that you have never been? And secondly, what would you like to see happen in 2026, and what do you most fear?
I think that there are lots of places I've not been, and even within for example, I haven't skimmed the surface of places like China. I've been to Italy dozens and dozens of times. I haven't skimmed the surface, and places of history and antiquity there, and so you get trapped in that. But in terms of kind of societies that I more broadly would like to understand better, particularly in where history I think is going, when I went to Argentina, it was the first time I've been in Latin America in over a decade, and I'd like to spend some more time and understand that a little bit. I've already got a whole bunch of travel, go back to Europe as part of my German Marshall world, and I'm learning more about defense tech and things that are happening there. But there are whole swaths of Eastern Europe in particular that I've not unpacked, and I think Eastern Europe has a front row seat, and maybe more than a front row seat, on the future of 21st century war. I mean, what's happening in Ukraine is not only terrible in its own right, but I think is a playbook of what 21st century war will look like in terms of technology and AI, swarm wars, and again, people's ability to be distracted, because of info war, how data is playing a significant role. And so I want to delve deeper in understanding this. I must say I've fallen in love with Asia in many respects, and I was in Korea and Vietnam all in the last year, and I'm looking forward to going back there just to sort of, again, enrich my understanding and see how things change. Because part of the good news about being on the ground is you're on the ground, you see things differently. The bad news about being on the ground is if you go a year not being on the ground, particularly in the world we're in today, things change all the time. So I travel with a tremendous amount of humility. I travel mostly with questions, and then I can put some connections together and test them. But I never come back thinking that I understand them at a level of depth that can take us there. I mean, the things that I think we need, I'm very optimistic, actually, in many respects. I think there's a lot that's being unleashed by new technology that we need a more thoughtful and deliberate conversation than our system allows us to have. But I think we're going to be on the cusp of curing cancer. I think that we have tools and capabilities of understanding that can reach people in ways that they could never be reached before. And I'm very hopeful about that. And I hope that we can knock the barriers out for people to have access to these capabilities and understand them, and to open up, bottom up as much as top down, serious conversations about the ramifications of this. Where do we want this to go, and how to engage in it overall? And, the world is always filled, Andrew, with black swans. I mean, every year of my life, there have been things that either have happened and surprised us, often very profound, like September 11th and stuff like that, and others that, that are brewing and we have to watch out for. I mean, I think it may only be to the benefit of the short term, but if in point of fact, the presidents of China and India meet 4 times, we'll have a different conversation. Whatever will happen, the conversation will become something different. And if it doesn't, then we know that trajectory goes, and that will be concerning to me. AI without conversation is concerning to me. Info war and the ability for people to get spun up and not check things as honest. When I do go on X from time to time, and almost invariably I just ask Grok, is this true or not? And I think we all have to build musculature that has us start to assume that what we see may or may not be real, and if it isn't, let's get to what is. That's both, I think, hopeful, but also very concerning to me.
Well, I couldn't get Marco Polo, so I got the next best thing, Chris Schroeder, globe-trotting entrepreneur, investor, reader, I no doubt, Chris, you'll read your 100 books again next year, and we will certainly have you on the show, hopefully before this time next year. But Happy New Year, healthy New Year. And it's always so refreshing to have someone so independent on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.